Unfinished lemonade tells me all I need to know about yesterday.
You had a name for this. You had a name for this, didn't you?
Well, I was just, the working title was Miller versus Berger, and me challenging your nonsense, basically.
We'll see how we get on.
Berger, do you mind if I call you Berger? Or do you
No,
prefer?
no, go ahead.
What's your general at work? How do people refer to you? Do you get Dr. Berger in your?
Increasingly the junior residents are calling me Dr. Berger. I can ask them to call me David however many times I like, but
Right.
I think I've become more grey-haired and more fierce. So now they feel they have to call me Dr. Berger. Yeah, no, whatever. You can call me Berger. Lots of people call me Berger.
All right, Berger. So when was the last time someone thought that you might have been too young to be their doctor? I was reflecting on this myself the other day.
Yeah, well, that would be never. When I was a medical student, they thought I was the registrar. So
Okay.
yeah, no, that's never.
I had more the other problem where I used to be asked for the newspaper when I went in to see my patients and have the newspaper. But at more recent times,
I can imagine you looked pretty baby-faced, Andrew.
I did, yes, and underdeveloped. And I in fact, these days it disappoints me how reassuring my arrival is to patients when they see me and they realize I'm not the new doctor on first sight. But I take it as reassuring.
I've got the double whammy in Australia in that I have age, grey hairs, a certain amount of confected gravitas, and a British accent, which actually confers another level of status, actually, which I didn't realize when I moved here. But
it gives that standard British accent does give a lot of reassurance to those of us in the colonies that you must know what you're talking about because you're the ones who lived the war. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of people who know who you are, and a lot of those will be listening to the podcast, but who've never had a conversation with you. And so I thought it would be useful to do so. And I suppose, my first proper question would be, well, what's the point of you? What is it that you are for?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty bolshy in the sense of I've always been a grumpy old man, and but allied with that, I'm quite the idealist, and actually went into medicine for very just naively idealistic reasons, which I think I've kept. The point of me is that I have a fairly wide-ranging knowledge and vision. I have a wide experience in medicine, and I have no vested interests or at least no position to protect within the medical hierarchy. I'm effectively a medical nobody. So I don't have an academic position. I'm not a medical politician, and yet I'm able, by dint of sometimes being outrageous and being categorical, to say things that many other people would like to say. And that's the point of me, to be an annoying thorn in the side. I was accused last week by a very senior Australian doctor, very, very prominent, of just being somebody who throws grenades. Well, in any war, you sometimes need a grenade thrower.
Yes, but you're not normally throwing them at the generals of your own army, are you? So you found yourself in a position of needing to, come out from a comfortable position that we're all in the profession, which is that we're down in the trenches, we're getting on with our daily job. sometimes I feel like a medical degree is a bit of a franchise that gives you a monopoly and an income and a trade to work. So how uncomfortable has it been for you to be having to get up and make your morning coffee and go out and make life difficult for the authorities?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very uncomfortable at times, as you well know, because you've been a staunch defender of mine, which I really appreciate. You're dead right when you say that the profession, the medical degree, is essentially a franchise, and it's a hell of a money-making franchise. It confers status, it confers wealth, respectability. It's the acme of achievement for many parents to see their child become a well-respected, wealthy doctor. But like I said, I am an absurd idealist, and actually we were brought up when I trained in medicine in London in the 1980s. I didn't appreciate it at the time, but we had a strong inculcation of the great of the works of the great physicians of the past. I mean, I went to St. George's Hospital. I trained at St. George's Hospital, which was where Jenner first conducted a smallpox inoculation on an unsuspecting 9-year-old. And so we were really brought up in that heritage, one of tremendous idealism. And I'm so old-fashioned that I forgot to forget the idealism. And so I find myself in a situation where I have very strong beliefs about the role of the profession towards the public and in public health. And those, in fact, do not chime with the majority direction of the profession, which seeks a route of accommodation and expediency with the prevailing forces. And, medicine is political, and there's the great quote from Berger about, medicine being politics by another name. And it really is. And everything we do is political. Every prescription we write has a political aspect to it. Just simply everything we do. And there's a kind of tacit agreement that we'll ignore that aspect. And I can't ignore that aspect. And so I feel very strongly that the duty of the physician is to present to the public a vision of health and a vision of public health that serves them, and not, for instance, corporate masters. So
what
I mean, one of the
I don't want to descend into the cynicism of Chekhov, who I think it was that said that he hates doctors more than lawyers because lawyers are thieves, but doctors are thieves who also want to kill you. And so what proportion of the jungle organism of the healthcare system do you think is going about things in goodwill towards patients with one eye on the cash register and making sure the business works? And what proportion is simply self-promoting? Do you think it is the same as or worse than other industries?
I think there's a very shining brand that has to be protected. I think there is a degree of hypocrisy that is much, much greater than in other industries. Doctors are they're not thieves and bastards who are just out to scam the public. A few are, but not the majority. But there is an underlying willingness to compromise on principle for the sake of an easy life, and to keep the cash rolling in and the lifestyle flowing.
I think that's true.
Yeah,
pretty
exactly.
much every aspect of society. So I suppose the notion that we're challenging is this reverential status
Yes.
of being given unquestioning.
Yes. And that's the brand. That's we trade on the brand of we are these selfless, noble heroes with a higher calling, and we trade on that brand.
But really, the reality is a bit different in that the only selfless heroes are actually you and me, and the rest of them are
exactly. The rest of them bunch of toe rags.
To what degree is it simply following the leader?
Well, I think if you talk to the medical leaders, they say, well, like when I talk to medical leaders, they say, well, you're right, David, of course, but our membership won't support that. So the leaders would say that they're following the membership. And so I think you get into this vicious circle, whereas actually true leadership is to inspire people to go to a place that they didn't know that they wanted to go to. And I think we see very little of that in medicine. I think we see very little of that in general in politics and society. Absolutely. Certainly these days. Politics is the art of the achievable.
I don't see any great objection to, for example, the dropping of masks in healthcare at the moment, which seems to me to be problematic. How do you analyse that?
And again, that comes back to this challenging this notion that we doctors are somehow these special beings with higher morals, higher values. I don't think we are. I also don't think we have higher insight. So I think that's what, we're as bad as multi-step reasoning and following through on the consequences of that multi-step reasoning as the rest of society.
So what would you do to improve that? Because it seems to me we have a regulatory system, which is exactly, to me, analogous to the legal system in general society, in that we live in the shadow of it rather than ever really interacting directly with it.
I think that comes back to the massive gap between work as imagined and work as done. So the things that we do and have to do on a daily basis to deliver the most appropriate care to patients are very different to how, for instance, the regulator would understand what we do. I mean, the mayhem of an emergency department at times, it just has to be seen to be believed. I mean, we had a riot in the waiting room a couple of weeks ago, a literal riot. And in this, it was the patients on that occasion, but so in that context, delivering care is extremely difficult, and those kinds of considerations, the considerations of the real world, are very, very different. So yes, you're right. There's a huge amount of theatre, and there's a huge amount of people simply doing what has to be done, irrespective of what the regulations are. I mean, just the concrete example of this, so people can understand. We're not allowed to send photos of patients by insecure means. So if you've got a patient with a burn,
that sounds like a very good idea.
It sounds like a great thing.
I'm in the committee now, and I'm
sounds like a great thing.
Other committee members. Actually, we're not even having a vote at the safety committee.
No,
somebody's just suggested this. We're all going, yeah, that sounds about right.
It's absolutely obvious that you want the most secure means of transport of confidential patient information. But it's 1 o'clock in the morning. You've got a patient with a severe burn. You've got a multi-trauma. You need advice. You've got a bone sticking out of the leg. The orthopedic surgeon wants to see a picture of that leg right now. And we're not allowed to send, for instance, by a mobile phone, by a text message. And there's supposedly some kind of secure mechanism by which these photos can be sent, etc. In practice, that does not exist in any way that I have ever come across. So every time that a doctor sends a photo of a patient in a critical situation to enhance the patient's care, with the consent of the patient, they're breaking the rules. So they stick their neck on the line every day to do that. And that's the gap between work as imagined and work as done. I mean, I think the thing to say is people are inherently good. And that's I do believe that. And they inherently want to do the right thing. There is an element of idealism for anybody who goes into a health profession, and they want to do the right thing by the patients. But it's a question of surviving within the organization. And I think it's you that's referred to the large health bureaucracies as self-healing organisms. And indeed they are, such that if you want to get on, you have to behave in a way that supports the functioning of the organism.
What can a patient do? Someone who's out there who's got long COVID at the moment, what's their best hope in approaching this sort of Kafkaesque? How do they find the people who will do the best for them in the face of a difficult system combined with a difficult patient problem?
Relentless questioning and relentless advocacy. And that will piss a lot of people off. But it is the squeaky wheel that gets the noise. And if you find that you're being fobbed off, ignored, you simply have to put the case more strongly. I do not think that we have, for all the rhetoric, a patient-centered healthcare system. And there is no doubt that many people get marginalized. For the sake of the smooth running of the system. So for the individual patient, I'm afraid there is no alternative to being polite, but firm and going, this is not what I need. I've got more questions. Can you please answer them? Blah, blah, blah. That's all you can do.
Perhaps it's best that patients come in a bit skeptical about their healthcare provider rather than assuming from the get-go that the first doctor they see is going to know what they're talking about and going to take their problem seriously, particularly if they have a complex problem like long COVID that doesn't necessarily fit yet with medical dogma, a contested area.
No question. And if you look at, the level of knowledge of many ordinary people about the nature of airborne transmission of not just COVID, but other respiratory infections now, it's way higher than that in the medical profession. And there's an enormous problem, which we've seen in the pandemic, with knowledge translation. In other words, the latest knowledge and understanding being translated into everyday medical practice. We've known that's a problem for years, but we see, it can take 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes never, for relevant information to get into medical practice. And now with the availability of information, with people able to Google, able to see on Twitter what the latest studies are, that contrast between what is known and what is being practiced is ever more dramatic. And I mean, just on a personal level, my dad, just to show how difficult this is, my dad, many years ago, about 20 years ago now, he was in his early 80s. He got flu. He then got a septic arthritis of his knee. He had a staph arthritis of his knee, was admitted to hospital perfectly correctly, was started on high-dose IV antibiotics, flucloxacillin. He then went into renal failure. This was in the UK. He was in his early 80s. He was okay. He wasn't in the best early 80-year-old, but he wasn't bad. And the doctor said in the hospital, they all knew me. I was a local GP. They all said, well, poor old boy, his time's up. And I said, his time isn't fucking well up, because he's got interstitial nephritis from the flucloxacillin that he's just had. And he needs he needs renal biopsy, and he needs high-dose steroids, and then it will get better. And they said, no, well, we'd have to transfer him to the regional unit. It's not really appropriate, blah, blah, blah. So I insisted. So sure enough, what happens? He's got interstitial nephritis from the antibiotics. He goes on to high-dose steroids. He gets better. He lives another 5 years. So now I had very specialist knowledge there and was able to insist and was prepared to insist. So I do think it's important for people to be well informed and to approach with a degree of healthy and polite skepticism. You know, when doctors roll their eyes about the patient coming in with printouts from Google and they go, "Oh, Dr. Google," you know, actually that's great. You've got an engaged person, you've got somebody who understands what's going on, who wants to understand about their illness, and who can be a good partner in that. You know, you can be a good partner to them in that journey. I think we're much too defensive, and I think we have to be much more open to people.
Part of the challenge is finding the voices that you trust, and my view has been that the voices to trust are the humanitarians. It's the ones who actually, you know, are trying to look after people rather than necessarily sell them something. And there's no shortage of doctors out there trying to sell things. But how did you find who to listen to during the pandemic? I mean, you've become a famous, some might say infamous social media scion now. What are we talking? Upwards of 50,000 hang off your tweets occasionally, and but you have good presence, and you've also become known to the wider stream media as a result. How did you find what people to listen to at the start of all this?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I've certainly developed a very good nose for bullshit over the years. And there is, I think it comes down to, as you said, those who are humanitarian, who speak plainly, and who cite both evidence and reason. It does seem to me that there is a knowable reality. Some things are more true than other things. And people who make reasoned deductions on the basis of both evidence and scientific thinking, where the evidence is lacking, and rationality underlying a humanitarian, with an underlying humanitarian voice, it seems to me those people relatively quickly show themselves to be trustworthy. Now, by contrast, you have like the people who say, well, you know, the shadow pandemic, lockdowns caused all this trauma and all this, you know, immunity debt. And so we're seeing enormous consequences of this over the years. And they will evince humanitarian aspirations and humanitarian ideals. And they say, well, we're just looking out for the wider people. But actually, there's nothing underlying in terms of evidence, in terms of rationale. So those voices are false. Those who say, you know, we're concerned about studies that show a 36 times incidence in pulmonary embolus in the 2 weeks after contracting COVID, or we're looking at an excess death rate of 13%. Those seem to me much more trustworthy. So I think it is a process. But you're right. I mean, we have been brought up to believe that people who are professors and have lots of letters after their name are the people to trust. And of course, the people who are professors with lots of letters after their name also push that notion. And we would like to think that everybody who is in the academic sphere, in the medical sphere, in the scientific sphere is good and has noble aspirations and noble ideals and a conscience as pure as driven snow. But the reality, as we've discussed before, is that we are all human. And I do not automatically trust somebody with lots of qualifications, because we all have agendas.
I think that's easier for those of us who have dealt firstly in the clinical area, because we know that, I'm sorry to say this, the professor isn't necessarily the best surgeon. The one who's perceived.
I was going to say that. There was a pancreatic surgeon there was a professor of biliary surgery when I trained, and like everybody in the hospital went, just don't go and see him. Just don't send any of your relatives to him. And we all know that. We all know those people.
It doesn't mean they're not the best surgeon because they are the professor. But the converse is also true. It would be more often than not that the person who hasn't devoted a large chunk of their time to academia, but who has in fact spent most of their time operating whilst being aware of the literature, living in the shadow of what's happening academically, that's most likely the person you want.
I mean, I think it's really hard for the general public to detect who to listen to and who not to. But as I say, there is some degree to which you have to go with your gut. Does this person actually sound like a humanitarian? Are they making sense? And is there some kind of scientific basis to what they're saying? I think the reality is that the regulatory system cannot guarantee that the people who are appearing as your talking heads on TV, etc., are actually telling you the best information. And that's the reality. We have bullshit in medicine, and we're just like any other profession, any other branch of humanity. There are bullshit artists, and they're really good at it, and you just have to try and sniff them out.
Well, one way.
Unfortunately, they're very beloved of executive producers on some TV shows. But
well, that's true. But one way of sniffing them out is to see how many times they've been wrong, or how many times they've asserted the wrong narrative, even if they didn't know that it was wrong. And I think so. You want a doctor who's a humanitarian. You want someone who's cautious. So in the face of an emerging risk, not someone who's saying, don't worry about all this, it'll be fine, it's all a bit of a fuss, when then we get 20% excess mortality, and then they go and try and deny that at the same time. But, that is an undeniable.
Blame it on lockdowns in South Australia, which had like three days of lockdowns or something.
Well, I think WA was less, even,
exactly.
We had
and Tasmania.
We had travel restrictions. We could only go as far as Kununurra and Esperance. So there was a lot of people who saw parts of Western Australia they'd never seen before. But certainly there was no there was no degree of lockdown, and that's a whole other question that we'll approach another time. But I did want to ask you where you are at the moment, and because you have a peripatetic kind of. I sometimes think of you as Phileas Fogg from. Round the world in 80 days. Just you seem to be around the world. So where are you at the moment?
So at the moment I'm on the North New South Wales coast, on the mid-north coast, the sort of near the hippie town of Bellingen, which was where we first moved when we came to Australia. But we pretty soon decided that we wanted to do, this, my wife's also a doctor, GP like me, that we wanted to do more interesting medicine than being in a suburban general practice. So since we arrived actually in Australia just over 10 years ago, we've been working at the hospital in Broome, working in the emergency department, on the ward, and in the high dependency unit.
Now that's not just down the road from where you are at the moment, though.
No, it's it's about as far as you can get on the other side of Australia. So we've actually just driven back in a Land Cruiser. We came back, it took us 10 days of hard driving. We came back mainly on dirt roads from Broome, which was good.
You took a shortcut.
We spent about half a year. We took a shortcut across the middle, which is a bit of a long cut. We didn't see another car for 3 days. So this is an amazing country here. So we spent about half the year up there working in the emergency department, which is about as challenging in so many different ways as I imagine medicine can be anywhere. So really interesting work, very heartbreaking sometimes, and really rubs you up against the question of treating downstream results as opposed to upstream causes. We're totally downstream. And medicine needs to be upstream, or at least a lot of it needs to be upstream.
So you suggesting that prevention is better than cure?
Horrors. Yeah, the best quote is, which I've just been repeating all the time, from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He probably got it from somebody else. So he said, there comes a point where you have to stop fishing bodies out of the river, down at the river mouth, and go upstream to see who's kicking them in. You know, and we're just fishing the bodies out of the bottom of the river. Upstream prevention, it's a bit dull, because nobody gets ill, and then people go, well, nobody's ill, so why do we need to do all this stuff? But that's really where the big gains are to be made. It's not in, you know, trying to get the HbA1c down by another 0.5% by adding in another diabetic drug into somebody who's got a body mass index of 50. You know, that has a degree of futility about it. That's
yes. So do you find that you are able to sustain this sort of by this lifestyle of spending 6 months immersed into that emergency department, because you can then spend a bit of time outside of that? And do you think it balances with the advocacy work that you do, trying to improve the upstream, or are they both incredibly taxing?
I couldn't just do that work. Probably 75-80% of our patients are Indigenous Aboriginal Australians, and dealing with that on a day-to-day basis relentlessly results in a very high degree of moral injury to healthcare workers. It's very hard to do that work and not get burnt out. Does it
make you angry?
It really makes me angry about, you know, the false promise of medicine. The medicine that we have today is so powerful and so incredible, and we are seduced by it. I mean, as humans, as hunter-gatherers, we are tool makers. You know, the history of our species, the history of the genus Homo since a million years is of refined tool making. The history of our species as Homo sapiens over the last 200,000 years is refined tool making and increased communication and the ability to cooperate to make amazing tools. And our drugs are the most amazing tools, and we are so seduced by them. But in fact, you know, we do so much that is self-defeating. We create the illness that we then go on to treat in this kind of virtuous loop or non-virtuous loop. And that's what makes me angry, is the futility of what we find ourselves forced to do.
People don't mind working very hard, but they do not like doing work that is futile.
No, exactly. And you just look at it, you go, I can put a sticking plaster on this today, but the damage was done so long ago. But
you have to do it, right?
Yes,
someone has to be there for that.
Of course you do. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the beauty of medicine. You know, that you're there, you've got the patient in front of you, you have this very clear moral duty to do your absolute best to help that person in the best way possible for them, taking into account everything, blah, blah, blah. So that's easy. So actually standing there on the day, you know, you don't give somebody a lecture on the, you know, the importance of avoiding ultra-processed food and not drinking 4 liters of Coke a day, etc. You just got to treat their MI or whatever. So that's easy. But there is an accumulated moral injury from that over time. And I don't think I could do that or every week of the year without getting extremely burnt out. So advocating, so just for my personal well-being, advocating for humanitarian aspects is very important. I spent a long time advocating for better treatment of refugees coming to Australia, and as you know, more recent, and against healthcare corruption, particularly in the World Medical Association. And now, as you know, I've been a vocal proponent of safety in the pandemic for all of us, but most especially those who are most vulnerable, who have no who are so much more at risk, and who I think have been grotesquely traduced during the pandemic, and are now being exposed to unacceptable risks in our healthcare system. And that's what makes me most upset and most angry, is that we are no longer even paying lip service to first do no harm. We don't care.
It seems you have these two polar sort of activities that you throw yourself into, and one of them in a way cures you of the other, and the other
it does.
So you spend your time in the emergency department putting the band-aids on because you know what to do for that person right in front of you, and there is a real satisfaction in the immediacy of dealing with your father's interstitial nephritis and fixing a problem that is fixable. In medicine, like in politics, like in law, like in everything, we want a problem that's fixable so that we can have a victory.
Exactly. I mean, look, it's fun, you know. It's a really interesting. I mean, I went into medicine because I absolutely love medicine. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and the sheer power of what we can do is incredible. I do think, I mean, here comes the bit where I kind of lament about the young doctors of today, but the young doctors of today, I mean, I'm not even that old, but they don't understand how things have changed, even in 30, 35 years. HIV has become a chronic manageable condition. I mean, these are incredible things. And so when you do something, when you make a great diagnosis, you manage to cure somebody, you put in a chest drain, you know, to relieve a pneumothorax, whatever. These are all incredible things to be able to do. And there are sometimes in the emergency department where we're going, yeah, we are the champions. We figured it out. Yeah. And so that's really, you know, that's really fun. I mean, it's of course we need that medicine. The fact is, a lot of it we shouldn't have to be doing. I mean, we'll always have to do some of it, but so much of it is like, we don't have to be doing this.
So you're like a firefighter who gets a real satisfaction out of putting out a fire, but every now and then you kind of want to make a fuss about why don't we have better fire safety? Why are we getting so many damn fires? Because who's making, and the fact that there are some people making money out of this, and there are other people wandering around going, saying, don't worry about all the fires. Don't listen to Berger. You know, he's trying to impinge on your freedom by saying that you need to have a fire extinguisher.
Exactly.
And
exactly. It's ridiculous to advocate for zero fires. What a ridiculous idea. You know, it's bizarre, but it's so weird, isn't it? The way, you know, we can advocate, you know, we have these manifest targets for like zero road deaths, which is totally unrealistic. I mean, there'll never be zero road deaths, but the governments spend billions trying to get to it. Presumably partly because that, you know, there's a lot of money in it for motor manufacturers to build safer and safer cars. So there's this kind of coincidence of aspirations. But in other things, you know, there really isn't any interest. So like the notion that we should have zero hospital acquired respiratory infections, for instance, that we should make our hospitals safe, people go, well, that's just ridiculous. You know, we can't even, what an absurd aspiration. And yet the history of humanity is that we are cunning, clever, fiendish, and we accomplish everything. We do the most amazing things. And yet the simplest things, if they're not politically expedient, we are indoctrinated to believe that they are impossible. And that's where I'm most upset about what I see as the failure of leadership in the medical profession, that the medical profession should not be doing the bidding of the pharmaceutical companies or a government whose only main short-term aim is to get people back into city centre business properties, CBD business properties, and to get coffee shops running again at full capacity. That's what really annoys me.
When our privilege gets revealed to us, we then have these constant moral judgments to make about how much do we go down into the abyss and look into the abyss trying to help, because you can give away all your wealth tomorrow walking through the streets of Africa and make no difference at all on a substantial sense, whatever. How much life are you entitled to reserve to yourself to enjoy? Do you think it's possible to have a balance where you're not beating yourself up too much, you're not getting in too much trouble, you're still doing your job, but you're actually making some sort of progress? Or is this, as people like Tolkien might suggest, a long defeat where we're just seeing sort of some nice pushback occasionally, but in the end things still get tending towards entropy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that things obviously, well, the nature of entropy is that everything tends towards the less ordered state, and that is the nature of the universe. But life, and particularly humanity, we are the entropy reversing process. Particularly, we reverse entropy on this local scale. We per capita command more and more energy. We control more and more of the solar energy that's reaching the planet. I do think that one can get terribly bound up with this kind of obsession with purity of motive. How pure am I? Am I doing enough? Should I be doing more, etc.? And I used to get very tortured by that, with this kind of absolutist view of things. And I think it's a very Western way of looking at things. I mean, I think you just do what you can. You just try not to be a shit in your personal life. And you try to work the best you can for others, given the limitations that you have, and none of us are perfect. And personally, I don't feel the need to kind of strive for perfection, which is a good thing because I'm so far off it. But I think just understanding that the quest for purity of motive is a quest. But you don't necessarily have to follow it. You can just try and do the best you can, and it's better than not doing the best you can.
And it's okay to take a holiday from it and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, exactly, because you're only human, and there's only so much you can do. And beating yourself up it's another kind of vanity in a way. It's like, I should be so perfect. I could be doing this. It's just like, come on, just loosen up a bit.
I think that's been a good orientation. Yeah. To my provocative question as to what's the point of view. I think
I'm gonna have to interview you and ask you what's the point of view.
No, that's not the premise.
Because that's a very interesting question as well.
It's not the premise. I'm not ready for that question. Maybe when I get to your esteemed seniority, then I'll be ready.
Of course.
If we do anything by sharing these chats, I want people to not feel alone, because there are people who don't have our privilege of having a pretty reasonable immune system, being able to get out. And people who find it difficult to access their healthcare at the moment. There are people who are split up from their families at the moment because there's no understanding about what it is they're going through. So if in having these chats, people can understand that there are those who have not just sympathy for them, but also strategy, also connection, also potentially some influence on the way people think about things, if not explicitly, then maybe we influence the way that people, thought leaders or decision makers do think, even though they might never want to admit it. And I suspect we can repeat the same conversation next time and just say it in a slightly different way.
Perfect.
Half-finished lemonade tells me all I need to know about yesterday. I'm back here again. I told myself I'd stay a while away. Solutions ahead, but don't carry on. Blinded by nothing, we'll wade through it all. Hold on, too dark. There's a grace in the fire and the flames. Thoughts drift too far. In this room I've lost my way. Old trees I climbed too far below me now. Where do I go when the signs aren't so bright and I'm weighed down by feeling I don't have much time? It's okay, I suppose, let's just hope that it goes. No need to stress over a failure to cope. I'll take my anguish and go.